Hello, I'm going to be talking about a very large-scale developer-funded excavation that took place in 2014 and 2015, directed by my colleague Giles Dorks at Pococks Field, Eastbourne. It was a multi-period site of roughly 3 hectares in size, with evidence ranging from a Bronze Age cemetery to a late medieval, early post-medieval farmhouse and brewhouse, and even a cache of World War II hand grenades in wooden crates, which made for some exciting times on site. This slide gives an idea of the density of archaeological features, but I'm going to be talking about perhaps the most significant element of the archaeology, the early to Middle Iron Age saltworking evidence. To introduce myself, my name is Doherty, and I primarily work as a prehistoric and Roman pottery specialist. I'm going to be touching on the pottery from the site and its relationship with the saltworking evidence, but I'm also mostly drawing on work on the stratigraphic element of the site by Giles Dorks and analysis of the briquetage by Trista Clifford. So a key thing to understand about the site is its environment and topography. Visiting the site, you have the sense of being in suburban Eastbourne. There are a lot of roundabouts. You're next to the hospital. But it actually lies in this quite interesting topographic zone. It's just 2 kilometres from the steep scarp slope of the Downs to the west, but it's very low-lying itself. It ranged from 13 metres above sea level to just 2 metres above sea level at the lowest point towards the southeast of the site. It's close to the coast, obviously, but the most important thing to know about it is that it lies at the fringes of the Winnington Levels. This is a mosaic of marshy peat and alluvium, known particularly for the excellent preservation of late Bronze Age organic remains at Shinewater. So in everything we're talking about, we have to bear in mind that this is a dynamic landscape, where water levels would vary both seasonally and according to episodes of climate change. Being at the very edge of the floodplain is key to the site's very existence, particularly when we're talking about saltworking, but it also would have been important for things like grazing livestock seasonally, hunting and foraging, as well as for access to fresh water from the streams that fed the wetlands. Unlike other wetlands in the southeast, there's no one major river system feeding the Winnington Levels. It's more a patchwork of small streams that have been extensively culverted and managed in more recent times. To set the site in its sort of chronological framework, we were able to do quite an extensive programme of radiocarbon dating, which suggests that the saltworking started around 470 to 395 Cal BC and ended between 230 and 85 Cal BC. And the thing about that date range is you could almost call it nearly wholly Middle Iron Age, but the material culture and particularly the pottery has much better parallels in early Iron Age assemblages, or perhaps early to Middle Iron Age transitional assemblages. I would take that to mean that most of the activity probably falls towards the beginning of that range. I think radiocarbon people would suggest we need to test our ceramic chronologies a bit more with radiocarbon dating, which hopefully will continue to happen. There does seem to be evidence for some settlement on the site in the form of a substantial enclosure containing a single roundhouse. It also contained 2 inhumation burials, and there's also a droveway to the north which runs between the downland and the marsh. There are reasonable assemblages of what you might call ordinary domestic finds like pottery, animal bone and objects like loom weights, but the settlement evidence is on quite a modest scale. This might suggest that occupation of the site was seasonal, but there may well have been other sort of more temporary structures that don't survive archaeologically. Primarily, this phase is characterised by the pits to the north of the enclosure, and they're filled with evidence for saltworking and particularly briquetage. And if anyone's not quite clear what the term briquetage means, it essentially means any of the ceramic evidence from the hearth structures, from supports, or from ceramic containers used in the evaporation of brine and later processing of salt. First off, it's important to note that we don't quite have the full chaîne opératoire of saltworking. What we're notably missing are the salt boiling hearths themselves in situ. That's in some ways a bit puzzling because we do have elements of most of the process, including parts of the hearth structures and things like supports. We have quite charcoal-rich fills that seem to probably come from the fuel used in the salt boiling process, but we don't have the hearths themselves surviving in situ. So to explain a bit more about how we think salt was produced in the Iron Age, we know that it must have been a multi-stage process. Seawater isn't actually as salt-rich as you might think. On average, it has a salt content of about 3%. And that means you have to process quite significant volumes of brine to produce any quantity of salt. Logically, you don't necessarily want to be carting huge volumes of liquid back and forth. So in most cases, we'd expect this process to be happening right at the edge of the source of salt water. Something else you need to do in this process is settling the brine in tanks to remove silts and impurities. You would need to reduce the volume of water and concentrate the salt to form a salt paste. But crucially, you probably need to do this stage many times because the first reduction often results in quite a bitter tasting paste. So we would need to reduce the salt and then add more water to wash it again and go back and forth with this process. And eventually you end up with a concentrated paste that can be left to dry and evaporate in a container where it crystallises to form salt cakes that are ready for onward transport and use. So these illustrations give an idea of the variability of salt working structures, and they come from archaeological evidence elsewhere in Britain and in France and the Low Countries. There's quite a lot of variation in design, but essentially they're quite simple structures where an either open or enclosed hearth is used in conjunction with some kind of support and large ceramic vessels where the liquid can be boiled away. So all of these elements are collectively what we would refer to as briquetage, and what we do have is a lot of briquetage. So on our site, container briquetage made up just 1% of the total weight, and it was generally found in quite fragmented condition, as you can probably see from these are the best bits that we chose to illustrate, and they're quite fragmented. I should just mention here that vessel briquetage constitutes vessel made of clay, and we'll come on to the issue of whether you can really distinguish clearly what is briquetage and what is pottery. Some vessel briquetage comprises quite sort of large trough-like vessels that are quite different to domestic pottery, but others are kind of round vessels that are quite small, and they're in quite similar forms to pottery. Essentially, when we talk about vessel briquetage, though, we're usually talking about these quite fascicular fabrics made with lots of organic components or shell or something like that that are going to burn out and leave quite a porous fabric that's quite good for circulating air and increasing evaporation. Classically, briquetage is associated with these kind of salt colours, oranges and pinks, and you quite often, as in the sherd that we have here in close-up, would get a kind of whitish surface, which is effectively bleaching of the surface from a chemical reaction with the chlorine in the salt. Supports made up 28% of our assemblage by weight, and we had quite a lot of these quite complete pedestals, and this may reflect their being deposited in sort of patterns of structure deposition, which I'll come on to later. There was evidence of reuse with some of these pedestals, with surfaces being patched up, suggesting the same objects were used over multiple seasons of salt working. And this category also includes things like stabilisers and clips, as we see here. Now, 20% of our total briquetage assemblage was structural material, and that means things like hearth flooring or superstructure. These are mostly kind of less photogenic elements. Here we have quite an unusual piece, though, which is a sort of perforated clay plate with latticed wattle impressions on the underside, for which there are a few parallels in Britain. We assume it might be part of some kind of raised or suspended oven floor, a little bit like you get in much later pottery kilns. And the remainder of the briquetage were miscellaneous pieces. I think in all likelihood they're probably most likely to fall into this structural material category. They're just quite abraded pieces of things like superstructure, but we couldn't actually necessarily assign them to that category because they're undiagnostic. In addition to the briquetage, I've argued in my pottery report that the Iron Age assemblage from the site may be functionally linked to the salt working process. One reason for this is the sheer size of the assemblage, which is about 300 kilograms, which makes it, I think, probably the largest Iron Age assemblage ever recovered in Sussex. Obviously, some older reports didn't necessarily quantify their pottery in the same way, so we're absolutely sure of that. And when we go back to our sort of fairly modest enclosure with one roundhouse, that just seems quite out of proportion to the scale of settlement that we're seeing. And the pottery also shares some characteristics of briquetage, particularly the tendency to be fired to these orangey pinkish hues, in a few cases more stereotypical lilac salt colours and bleaching that we discussed earlier. They also, there seems to be a preponderance of these quite open conical forms that are quite similar to some vessel briquetage and would be suitable for kind of evaporation processes because they have a little bit more surface area and they're quite open. And also just the lack of vessel briquetage of more traditional type in the assemblage, remembering that it only made up 1% of our briquetage assemblage. So how might domestic pottery have been used in the salt working process? One idea comes from parallels in the Pas-de-Calais region in France. Here, a number of sites have produced evidence for clay-coated wooden frames used in a conjunction of a variety of vertical surfaces like fixed or removable racks or grills, on which multiple smaller cylindrical or conical vessels could have been held in place by clay spacers. These are some images from experimental archaeology projects in France based on archaeological evidence. If pottery was used in this sort of process, it may have been necessary to crack it open at the end to release the salt cake, and that could explain the sort of volumes of pottery that we're getting at the site. Moving back to the stratigraphic evidence, it primarily comprises over 200 pits, which produced a huge amount of briquetage and the pottery that we've been discussing. Two morphological types of feature were identified, and these are defined as tanks and pits. The tanks were very distinctive in form, although somewhat varied in size. They're subrectangular with rounded corners. They kind of look a bit like a bath. They're often strikingly regular and symmetrical and appear to have been excavated with some care. They have strong morphological similarities to features interpreted as brine settling tanks on other salt working sites. Now, the chalk pits do to some extent hold water, but there was some evidence that these had been lined with clay, and in one case there was evidence of a clay and wattle lining. The pits are a bit less distinct in terms of their morphology. They're mostly subcircular. They range from some slightly deeper straight-sided examples to very shallow scoops. Again, there was evidence in a few that they'd been lined with clay. Not all of them necessarily had a primary function in salt working. Some look a little bit similar to your typical Iron Age grain storage pits. It certainly appeared that the deposition of salt working waste was targeted on the pits, and they contained just a lot more material than the enclosure ditch or anything inside it, particularly the building itself. And crucially, a full range of briquetage was recovered from the salt working pits and tanks. If we go back to our model of repeated processes of boiling and settling, it seems as if the primary extraction and boiling of brine and hearths must have taken place relatively close by, although we don't have the in situ hearths. The area where the salt working pits were located is low-lying, but not necessarily the most low-lying edge of the site. We think that the edge of the marsh was probably about 100 metres away to the east. In some ways, the fact that both liquid brine and heavy clay briquetage seem to have been carried back and forth to some degree up quite a gentle slope is a bit puzzling. One explanation is that the briquetage was brought from the marsh edge to maintain a clean working area there. And there has been some kind of evidence of quite organised waste management on other salt working sites. We did some work to try and further classify these pits, whether spatially or according to their contents or sequence of fills. And there was sort of a lack of very clear results there. Here are some pits and tanks together on site. But there was a general pattern in the filling of both types of feature. They often had fairly sterile primary fills, suggesting that they'd been left to silt up for a time, although this evidence was slightly complicated by the fact that these initial fills were often somewhat rich in animal bone. Both the pits and the tanks were often characterised by clear sequences of black and red fills. The former were charcoal rich and the latter contained briquetage and burnt flint. While much of this material appears to have come straight from the salt working hearths, there are also some evidence that these pits were receiving domestic artefacts as well, probably from the enclosure in the building. The main differences that we could define between the two types of pits were in their secondary deposits. By total weight, 77% of the briquetage and 87% of the unidentified fired clay was recovered from secondary and upper fills of the tanks as opposed to the pits. But this distinction was less clear with the pottery, which, as I've argued above, may be associated with salt working. Another interesting feature of the salt working pits was a clear association with structured deposition of animal remains, often seemingly placed as closing deposits. For example, a hunting dog on the left, and the deposition of a horse skull, which appears to have been fleshed at the time of burial, deposited with a defleshed pelvis in another pit to the right. The latter, in particular, appears to demonstrate an element of symbolism and ritual to the way these pits were being filled. This feature, interestingly, was the last in a sequence of intercutting saltworking features and appeared to be morphologically identical to the brine settling tanks, but was of very small size, so perhaps not practically usable as such. The only other of these miniature salt tanks contained 4 of the most complete briquetage pedestals. It seems that there's no purely practical reason for discarding functional objects like this that take some time and effort to manufacture, so it may be hypothesised that these were dug for the purpose of receiving structured deposits at the end of a season or whole phase of salt working at the site. And that leads on to the question of who were the salt workers. In fact, evidence of any kind of settlement evidence in association with salt working is rather unusual. Given the climate, it is likely to have been seasonal, and there's been some discussion about whether salt working may have been viewed as an activity subject to beliefs and taboos and undertaken at the margins of society. This has also been hypothesised for metalworking, and both are processes of transformation which may have involved processes which seemed mysterious to wider society. So to sum up, I think this final slide gives an idea of the scale of the saltworking pits. And the number of pits and the quantity of briquetage and saltworking suggests production beyond the household scale. And the arrangement of the site with a droveway leading to the downs hints at a relationship with communities beyond, who were probably receiving the salt and using it in the hinterland of the site. I think in the future we'll hope to identify more of this material on sites further afield and try and trace some of the pathways of salt working in East Sussex. Thank you.